19. March of 1944. The sirens always came before dawn. A deep, metallic wail that tore through sleep, through dreams, through hope. Every woman in Germany knew that sound. It was the sound of fear becoming real. Mothers would leap from their beds, pull on coats over nightgowns, and gather their children with trembling hands as the bombs began to fall. Streets that had been quiet moments before turned into rivers of panic. The earth shook, glass shattered, and the sky itself burned red. In that firestorm, the women of Germany began a silent war of their own, one not fought with guns, but with endurance. Anna Weber used to be a teacher in Dresden. Before the war, she had taught poems and history to children who dreamed of growing up in a better Germany. Now, she carried buckets of water to the ruins where her school once stood, searching for anyone still alive beneath the rubble. Her husband had gone to the Eastern Front years ago. The letters stopped coming long before the city was reduced to ash. Around her, other women moved like ghosts' faces smudged with soot, hands torn and bleeding as they pulled bricks aside with bare fingers. Every scream from beneath the ruins sounded like the echo of her own heartbreaking. When the fires finally died down, the city was unrecognizable. Dresden had been a jewel once, full of music and art. Now, it was nothing but twisted metal and dust. Anna stood in what used to be her classroom, the blackboard still faintly showing the last lesson. Hope is what remains when everything else is lost. She touched the chalk marks with shaking fingers and whispered, "Then, hope is all we have left." Across Germany, millions of women like her carried the impossible weight of a nation collapsing. They queued for hours for bread that never came, patched clothes until they were little more than rags, and buried loved ones in shallow graves. The men were gone, dead, captured, or still fighting a war that had already been lost. It was the women who held the country together, not out of loyalty to any leader, but because there was no other choice. The world had turned to chaos, and survival was the only resistance left. In the countryside, the story was no gentler. Fliesel, a farmer's wife near Cologne, rose before sunrise to milk the cows, tend the fields, and keep her 3 children fed. The sky often glowed faintly orange from distant bombings, a reminder that destruction was never far away. When soldiers came through, she lowered her eyes and prayed they would pass without taking more than food. She learned to hide what little she had, to keep her children silent when strangers knocked, and to smile through terror so they wouldn't see her fear. Winter 1944 came like punishment. Coal was scarce, food scarcer still. The women gathered bits of wood, burned furniture, anything to keep the cold from killing them. Many traded jewelry for potatoes, coats for flour, dignity for a handful of warmth. Hunger became a constant ache, an invisible enemy gnawing at every stomach. Yet somehow, through the hunger and fear, they endured. They whispered lullabies to sleeping children, their voices trembling but soft, trying to convince them the world would be kind again someday. By 1945, the end was near. The radio crackled with rumors: defeat, surrender, occupation. Each word carried both dread and relief. For Anna and Liesel, defeat meant survival. Victory had long lost its meaning, but the arrival of foreign troops brought new uncertainties. They had heard stories, some true, some twisted by fear, about what happened when armies marched into broken cities. The women clutched their children and prayed for mercy when the American forces entered the western towns. The streets filled with silence. German flags disappeared overnight. Fear took their place. Soldiers moved through the ruins, offering food to children who hadn't smiled in months. Some women wept just to see bread again. But in other regions, things were harsher. Revenge, suspicion, and confusion ruled the days. The women who had survived years of bombing now faced the cold weight of guilt. They were seen not as victims, but as symbols of a defeated enemy. Anna remembered walking through the ruins one morning when she found a small piece of paper fluttering near a pile of bricks. It was from an old newspaper headline, "Victory for the Fatherland." She stared at it for a long time, then crumpled it in her hand. The words meant nothing now. The only victory left was to stay alive. In the following weeks, she joined a group of other women clearing rubble. They called themselves Trümmerfrauen, the Rubble Women. with shovels, picks, and bare hands. They rebuilt walls, stone by stone, determined to reclaim something from the wreckage. They wore scarves over their hair and old men's coats, faces streaked with dust and sweat. When they worked, they didn't speak much. They had seen too much to waste. Words, yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was strength. The kind of strength that only comes from losing everything and still refusing to give up. One afternoon, a group of Allied officers stopped by to oversee reconstruction. One of them, an American, watched the women quietly. He approached Anna and asked through an interpreter, "Why do you keep working like this? The war is over." She looked up, eyes hollow but steady, and replied, "Because we are still here, and that means we must begin again." The officer said nothing more, but he never forgot the way she said those words. In every town, similar stories unfolded. Women opened makeshift schools in basements, taught children to read using burned pages of old books, and shared food with neighbors even when they had little. Some became nurses in hospitals without medicine. Others risked their lives helping displaced families find shelter. The men who returned from the front came home to strangers, the wives who had learned to survive without them, the mothers who had buried sons, the daughters who had grown old too soon. By the summer of 1945, the ruins began to bloom with flowers again. Life, fragile and persistent, pushed through cracks in the concrete. The women planted seeds where bombs had fallen, painted over bullet holes, and sang "Two Babies Born in a World Still Scarred by War." Anna once told Marta, another worker beside her, "We may never forget what was done, but maybe our children won't have to remember it." Marta smiled faintly, her hands covered in dust. "Then we build for them, not for us." Still, the nights were hard. The nightmares didn't stop. The sound of sirens haunted them in their sleep, the memory of flames still alive behind their eyes. Yet every morning they rose again, carried water, cleared rubble, cooked soup, and stitched torn clothes. They had become the backbone of a country that barely existed. Without their quiet labor, there would have been no Germany left to rebuild. Anna often thought of her husband. She didn't know if he was alive somewhere or buried beneath the endless fields of the East. Sometimes she imagined him walking through the door, dirty and tired, but smiling. Other times she accepted he never would. The war had taken too much for her to hope recklessly, but even in grief, she found purpose. When she looked at the faces of children playing among ruins, she saw the reason to keep moving forward. The Trümmerfrauen became symbols of resilience. Newspapers eventually began to photograph them, women standing proudly among piles of stone, hammers in hand, faces lit with strength instead of despair. They had rebuilt more than walls. They had rebuilt the idea of humanity. The world began to see that war had not only destroyed cities, but had also revealed a quiet, unstoppable courage among those who had been left behind. At night, when the city lights flickered weakly back to life, Anna stood by her window, watching the stars return, the same stars she had once pointed out to her students, telling them that even in darkness, light remains. The war had changed everything: her home, her body, her heart, but not that truth. Light still existed. It was there in every woman who refused to surrender, in every hand that lifted a stone, in every lullaby sung over hungry children. And as the wind whispered through the empty streets of Dresden, Anna closed her eyes and whispered, "We survived." When peace finally came, it didn't sound like peace. It came quietly, like a breath after years of screaming. The bombs stopped falling, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Germany was a graveyard of memories, and its women were the ones left to bury the past while somehow creating a future. The war had ended, but for millions of women, the struggle had only begun. Food was still scarce, homes still gone, and the lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. The once proud cities Berlin, Hamburg, alone were shadows of themselves. Every corner carried the scent of smoke and sorrow. In Berlin, a young woman named Greta Muller walked through the ruins with a small notebook in her hand. She was once a university student, now a searcher. Every day, she wrote down the names of the missing neighbors, friends, entire families. The notebook had become a record of a vanished generation. She often stopped by the wall of a destroyed church, where someone had written in chalk, "Whoever finds me, tell my mother I'm alive." Greta would trace the words and whisper, "If only I could." In those early months of defeat, women like Greta bore not only hunger, but also the heavy burden of shame. Many had been loyal citizens, not soldiers. Yet the world saw them through the shadow of what their nation had done. They were mothers and daughters, but also witnesses to horrors they hadn't chosen. The guilt clung to them like ash. The occupying soldiers brought both hope and fear. Some offered food and kindness, others abuse and power. Countless women were assaulted in the chaos that followed surrender. The war had taken their husbands, their homes, and now even their dignity. But still, they endured. Those who survived the nights gathered in the mornings, eyes hollow, yet alive, sharing bread and silence. Marta, one of the Trümmer, remembered the day she first saw Berlin's streets filled with Allied trucks. She watched from behind a shattered wall, clutching her coat. A soldier threw her a chocolate bar. She didn't take it, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she no longer trusted anything that came from war. Trust, like peace, had to be rebuilt, brick by brick. By 1946, the women began to reclaim what little they could. The government was gone, the leaders dead or captured, but ordinary people needed to eat. The Trümmerfrauen became the silent army of rebirth. They cleared millions of tons of rubble, brick by brick, turning ghost cities into places where children could laugh again. They didn't ask for praise, only for strength. Anna, now older and thinner, continued her work every day. Her hands were calloused, her back bent, but her eyes still carried a quiet fire. She once told a reporter who came to photograph them, "You see ruins, we see tomorrow." That line appeared in a newspaper a week later, and for the first time in years, Anna smiled. Her words had given others hope. In small kitchens, women made soup from potato peels and melted snow. They taught children to read by candlelight, using scraps of books that had survived the flames. They traded buttons, thread, and stories, tiny things that kept them human. At night, when the world felt cold and cruel, they whispered to each other, "We lived through hell. That means we can live through anything." Time passed slowly. The cities began to change. Streets were cleaned, tram lines rebuilt, shops reopened. The men who returned from war were strangers to the women who had survived it. He had seen different kinds of battles. He had fought with weapons. She had fought with hunger and loss. They spoke different languages of pain. Some marriages didn't survive. Others were rebuilt, like the cities, slowly, painfully, but with care. And among the rubble, love found a way to grow again. Anna met a widower, Karl, who had lost everything but a violin. He played softly each evening, and she listened from her window. One night, he played a tune she recognized, something she had taught her students years ago. She stepped outside, tears in her eyes, and said, "You remember?" Karl nodded. Music is what war couldn't kill. By 1948, when the Berlin airlift began, the women once again carried the burden of survival. As planes flew overhead, dropping food supplies, children ran to catch the small parachutes of chocolate and flour. Anna laughed, for the first time in years, holding a bar of chocolate as if it were gold. The sound of engines, once a symbol of terror, had become the sound of hope. Greta's notebook was nearly full by then. Many names were crossed out, some found alive, others confirmed dead. Yet, at the end, she wrote one last line, "We are the witnesses of endurance." She closed it and placed it inside a rebuilt church, beneath a candle. That notebook still exists in a museum today, filled with names that history almost forgot. The years rolled on, and a new generation grew. They asked their mothers what the war was like. Most women didn't answer directly. They would just say, "It was the time when we learned how strong we could be for them." Silence was a form of healing. The pain was too deep for words, but the strength was too real to fade. In the 1950s, when West Germany began to rise again, many forgot the faces of those who had cleared the ruins. The women who had carried stones, buried the dead, and raised children among ashes were rarely mentioned in the speeches of politicians. But among the people, they were remembered. In every home, every rebuilt street, their fingerprints remained. Anna grew old in a small apartment overlooking a new Dresden, city of lights, laughter, and music once more. Sometimes she would sit by the window, the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, and think of the day the sirens had first wailed. The world had turned upside down since then. She had seen death, hunger, cruelty, and finally, peace. On her last birthday, her granddaughter asked, "Grandma, were you brave in the war?" Anna smiled softly. "No," she said. "I was just a woman who refused to stop living. Hope is what remains when everything else is lost." And somewhere, far beyond time, every German woman who had lived through those dark years, every mother, sister, and daughter, stood together in the memory of a world that tried to break them, but never could. They were the quiet heroes of a broken nation. They were the women who refused to disappear. They were the soul of survival.